Today, we are discussing the most important thing ever. Really. I'm not exaggerating. The most important thing ever for us human beings, for us Catholics. And what is it? It's deification. It's becoming gods. St. Irenaeus of Lyons in the 2nd century said, quote, "He who was the Son of God became the Son of Man, that man might become the Son of God." End quote. If you liked our last episode 182, with Dr. Matthew Sakonikas on deification, divinization, theosis, how we can become gods by accepting God's invitation to participate in his divine nature, you're going to love this episode. So last episode, we focused on sources in the Western Church. In this episode, there's more of a focus on the Eastern Church, the Catholic Church in the East. St. Athanasius in the 4th century said, quote, "For he was made man that we might be made God. And he manifested himself by a body that we might receive the idea of the unseen Father, and he endured the insolence of men that we might inherit immortality." This episode is all about our destiny, the heights to which we are called as Catholics. And this is a reality that embarrasses many Catholics, makes us uncomfortable. I mean, after all, wasn't it Satan who first brought up the possibility of deification to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? In Genesis, it says, "Ye shall be like gods." And do we want to follow that? You can understand where some hesitation comes here. Wasn't that the great temptation? Yet at the same time, in Psalm 82:6, it says, "I say, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you." And Jesus quotes this verse from the Psalm in John 10:34 when he says, "Is it not written in your law, I said you are gods?" So in this podcast, we're going to tell it like it is, even if it can be hard to hear, even if it can be hard to imagine. St. Maximus the Confessor in his Ambigua in the 7th century said, quote, "The word of God became man, so that man might become God by grace." End quote. And he goes on, quote, "All that God is, except for an identity in essence, one becomes when one is deified by grace." End quote. And yes, sin gets in the way of this, but it's not the only thing that gets in the way. Human formation deficits can also get in the way, and they often do. Now, all of our parts are called to participate in this deification, in sharing God's nature, in becoming godlike, in becoming God by union with him. All of our parts are called, even our most reviled exiles, our most banished and abandoned parts, all of us, no part left out, no part left behind. And in this episode, we're going to discuss the existence of evil, the reality of evil. The way that Satan approaches parts is so different from the way that God reaches out to parts. And what are these parts? Well, parts feel like separate, independently operating personalities within us, each with its own unique, prominent needs, roles in our lives, emotions, body sensations, guiding beliefs and assumptions, typical thoughts, intentions, desires, attitudes, impulses, interpersonal style, worldview. Each part also has an image of God. And in addition to all of that, in this episode, we cover Star Trek, the movie Inside Out, St. Gregory of Nyssa, the concept of Nepsis, popcorn, specifically buttered popcorn, prayer as being with God, what Dr. Gerry's cat Nebula can teach us about prayer, and the importance of kindness and gentleness with parts so that they can experience love part by part. And finally, riding the Hot Mess Express into heaven. So, buckle up. Here we go. I am Dr. Peter Malinowski, also known as Dr. Peter. I am your host and guide in this Interior Integration for Catholics podcast, and I am so glad to be with you. I'm a clinical psychologist, a trauma therapist, a podcaster, a writer, the co-founder and president of Souls and Hearts. But most of all, I am a beloved little son of God, a passionate Catholic who wants you to be able to taste and see the height and depth and breadth and warmth and the light of the love of God, especially God, your Father, to participate in the divinity of God, your Father. I want you to embrace your identity as a beloved little son or a beloved little daughter of God. And all last year, 2025, and much of this year in 2026, we're doing a deep dive into internal family systems, IFS, parts work, Catholicism, bringing those together. We're bringing in the insights from internal family systems developed by Dr. Richard Schwartz. We're bringing in other parts and systems models. We're harmonizing them with the truths of the Catholic faith. Why? To help you live out the three great loves and the two great commandments. To love God, to love your neighbor, and to love yourself. That's what this is all about. And to love in such a way that you become in union with God, that you can embrace fully this partaking of God's divine nature. This is episode 183 of the Interior Integration for Catholics podcast. It releases on June 1st, 2026, and it's titled, Can Catholics Become Gods? Straight talk from Mother Natalia. So back in our virtual studio, Dr. Gerry is here with me. He's actually hosting this episode. I am his co-host. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist in Atlanta, Georgia. He's the founder and owner of Transfiguration Counseling. He's the author of this excellent book, Litanies of the Heart, published by Sophia Press. And he's a leading Catholic thinker and synthesizer in this whole area of Catholic parts work with a particular interest in what the Eastern Church has to teach us. He's the co-founder with me of Souls and Hearts. In 2019, we've been going strong for a lot of years now, and he's been on the podcast many times. So it is so good to have you back with us, Dr. Gerry.
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm so excited to have my dear friend, Mother Natalia, here. I am just thrilled to be able to talk to her today, and welcome, Mother Natalia.
Okay, this is really exciting. We have Mother Natalia with us today. This is great. All right, so Mother Natalia, she entered Christ the Bridegroom Monastery, a Byzantine Catholic community in Northeast Ohio in 2015. She made her life profession on September 26, 2021. And as a military kid, Mother Natalia grew up in a variety of places from Cuba to Denver. She earned her bachelor's degree in engineering physics from the Colorado School of Mines. Her route to monasticism passed through urban missions, both with a simple house of Saints Francis and Alphonsus and teaching high school math in the inner city. She co-hosts the What God Is Not podcast with Father Michael O'Loughlin and has been a frequent guest on Pints with Aquinas with Matt Fradd. A few of her great pleasures in life are hiking, running, and watching Star Trek. Not at the same time. And the great thing is that Dr. Gerry and Mother Natalia are such good friends. And Dr. Gerry has been on her podcast, What God Is Not, several times. It's such a joy to have you with us. So glad that we can all be together.
And we are both, we've been on her podcast, What God Is Not, and talk about a little bit Star Trek. So we both are Trekkies, and we're both here with our Star Trek mugs. We're also big Lord of the Rings fans, so we may, who knows, that may come up. You never know.
Well, I may be able to keep up with both of you with the original Star Trek a little bit, and then with the Next Generation. And with the Lord of the Rings, I can hold my own. But yeah, if you get into the subsequent ones, I'll get lost in terms of Star Wars.
You won't be able to follow us on Star Trek Voyager.
No, I can't say that I will. But
I really love Voyager.
Great. But we're here to talk about this really deep subject, theosis, which we've been talking about. So a lot of our listeners are somewhat aware. But, most Catholics kind of hear about sanctification. They might hear about different aspects, maybe even divinization as a word, but may not always have, an understanding of the Greek word theosis. And I would love, Mother Natalia, because you are at Christ the Bridegroom Byzantine monastery, and I would love just to get your sense of how the Eastern approach and what theosis really means to you.
Sure. Well, theo is the word that means God, right? Like in theology, it's the study of God. In the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, Theotokos is the phrase meaning literally translated God bearer. So it's that theo means God. So in theosis, it's the process of becoming God. And that sounds kind of scandalous to say. I think we try to soften it when we talk about it. We usually say it's becoming like God or becoming close to God, but it's actually a becoming God, which happens through union with Him, communion, and that process starts in this life. But the Eastern perspective, at least, and this might be the Western perspective as well, I just don't know, but in the East, the process of theosis is seen as something that will happen for all eternity. So it's not like once we reach heaven, the theosis is complete. It's even in heaven for all of eternity, we are becoming more and more one with God. Not just becoming more like Him, but becoming more one with Him. And when I think of the word theosis, what pretty much immediately pops into my head every time is the quote from St. Athanasius in his treatise on the Incarnation, where St. Athanasius says, God became man so that man might become God. This was his reason for the Incarnation, was so that we could be God, be in communion with Him. Yeah.
I love what you just said about, excuse me, what you just said about it's ever going, ongoing, as an emphasis in the East. And I could be wrong. I think it's St. Maximus who made that point, but he was probably making that point off of others, maybe Gregory of Nyssa or someone. But this idea that it is never ending, like throughout eternity, because of course God's essence and our essence is not the same. And we will forever be growing in that knowledge of God and that ever expanding union with Him. So it's actually not boring. It's not like a stat, like you're not just, oh, here I am, I made it.
Yeah.
Theosis, click.
Which I think that's a confusing concept to some people of, well, wouldn't you eventually get there? And because if it's for all eternity, at some point, wouldn't you get there? And what I like to think of is there's this concept. So I studied, my background is in engineering, and there's this concept in engineering of, I don't actually remember the name of it, but basically if you consider, like, if you're going across a football field, and if you go half the distance across the football field, and then half the distance and then of what's remaining, and then half the distance of what's remaining, and half the distance of what's remaining, if you could move at the level of microns, right, then you would never actually reach the finish if you're always only going half, even if it's for all eternity. And so that's kind of how I think of this concept of theosis is we are continuously moving towards this oneness with, but just forever. Yeah.
So in mathematics, I think that's called an asymptote. I don't know about engineering, but where if in a mathematical function as you approach, but in this case, it would be like a deepening of an actual union or state. So it wasn't. It's not like you never quite get there. It's like you're becoming more and more. And I really like this is I really like how you didn't pull any punches and you didn't try to soften what this is, kind of peddle it as though almost we're like embarrassed, like to say, hey, but leading with Athanasius, telling us like it is. I like that, Mother Natalia. That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm not really one to pull punches, so gets me in trouble. But
well, we're willing to get into trouble here if it's in service of the truth and goodness and beauty, and especially in the service of union with God. That's what it's all about. So.
And you might be right, Gerry, that it's Maximus. I can't recall actually. I love St. Maximus so much that anything that I love in theology, I'm like, it was probably Maximus.
He probably said it, right?
Or Evagrius. I also really love Evagrius. So I'm like, it was Maximus or Evagrius.
Well, there's a term, and I wanted to find it. It starts with an E, and there's a K in it, and it's thesis or something along those lines that is the term for that ever expanding.
Oh, okay.
But I'm not going to be able to pull that out of my head
Yeah,
on the
I don't know
spot. I just love that concept. Well, but let's kind of click in with parts just a little bit, because when I imagine kind of theosis or this sort of transformation, then I imagine all the parts being unburdened. I imagine all the parts being united in with the self, but I also imagine the inmost self being also transformed in a way like purely luminous, if you will, like completely not clouded in any way, no barriers, right? And so I guess I'm curious your thoughts on that too. Like it would be the state, I think, of our parts being unburdened, our parts being all transfigured, and so that the whole person is transfigured.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to your thoughts on that, because that seems pretty lofty. And
I think you're right though, because this is actually a concept in the East as well. So in the West, you hear a lot about saints who have the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, and like when they've reached some level of sanctity. And in the East, I've heard of that like a couple of times, I think, but it's not very common. But what you do hear about in the stories of the saints in the East is like an illumination. Their face glows, their person glows. And I think that's so I think there's actually something to that, of this transfiguration. I'd actually can I share this quote? I told you guys that I wanted to share a quote, and it's from I'm reading this book right now, which is very excellent, called Face to Face, Knowing God Beyond Our Shame. Have either of you heard of this?
No.
It's really incredible. It's by Father Stephen Freeman, who's an Orthodox priest. He's an archpriest. And I just came across this part the other day while I was on Pustynia, while I was on retreat. And I was like, this is perfect for the podcast. He's talking about, he's actually talking about something that Saint Gregory, that ironically Hans Urs von Balthasar, ironic from an Orthodox priest, says about something from Saint Gregory of Nyssa. But here's the quote. Anything unstable is not us. Saint Gregory's intuition is vital in the process of our healing. There is a me beneath the encrusted and obscured versions of the self that are generated by the dynamic of shame in our lives, as well as by other factors. It tells us that as we do the difficult work of healing, unlearning, discovery, and such, the content of repentance in the spiritual life, there is a goal that awaits us. We journey toward the true self, the image of God, the place of his true reflection, and in that place we discover that who we are stands before him without shame or fear. This is the place of our salvation. And so I just love that he's like, this priest is saying that the whole process of salvation, in other words, the process of theosis, is all about coming to our true selves, to the image of God within us. And if Christ is transfigured on Mount Tabor, I think that the image of God within us, as we come closer and closer to that image, is that transfiguration.
Well, I think a really interesting access point to that, right, is this question of shame and how we may have parts that are carrying burdens, right, of shame. And so, and in a way that gets in the way of being able to have that, true or core self be completely, actualized, if you will. And so I love that. That book sounds really fascinating.
Yeah.
So are you suggesting, dear Dr. Gerry, are you suggesting that it might not just be sin that keeps us from God or keeps us from theosis, but it might be something in our human formation, something in the way we're ordered that might be an effect of original sin, or as I know you like to say, original trauma? Because I think sometimes people might have a really, I don't know, maybe simplistic understanding that, if I'm not in union with God, then I'm sinful, right? That it's just sin that keeps us from union with God. So I'm just curious what both of you might have to say about that. If there are, for example, natural developmental processes that have to happen, or if there might be some integration that might need to happen among things that might be disordered or things that might just need to be developed, but that aren't really in and of themselves, vicious or sinful.
I think this is an interesting. I'm scared to go here. I don't know. I know I said I don't pull punches, but this
is all speculative, right? We can say
I'm gonna admit that I'm not super well educated in this particular realm, but I'm gonna put it out there at least as a concept, which is that in the East there is this concept of involuntary sin. So I would even argue, like, things are spoken of as being involuntary sin, even things like natural disasters or miscarriages. And so I want to be very, very clear here. Very, very clear, which is why it's a scary place to go if the concept is not rightly understood, is that I think that there's a different understanding of what sin is. Because to call a natural disaster an involuntary sin, to call a miscarriage an involuntary sin, is not saying you have done something wrong to deserve this punishment. That's not what it's saying. That's not saying that, like, this is something that you are personally responsible for.
Okay.
Sin is being used in that sense. I think more in the sense of sin is the existence of evil, the reality of evil in our world, and that we are victims of sin. We are victims of evil, even if we have not been the ones to perpetrate the evil. And the reason I think that can be so beautiful, if properly understood, is that, like, I've spoken with many women actually who have had miscarriages, who have found great comfort in this, which you would think intuitively that it's the opposite. But because there's so much unknown of, like, how do I heal from a miscarriage? Where do I bring this? Like, how do I heal from this trauma that I've incurred? And to have a place, and there's obviously there's counseling for this, and that's very important, but also to have a place spiritually to bring this, to be able to talk about it in the context of confession, not, again, to be very clear, not in the context of I've done something wrong and I need forgiveness for this, but in the context of confession is listed in the Catechism as one of the sacraments of healing. So we are going and saying, I need the divine physician to come and heal this brokenness that's in me, this wound that I've incurred, which is why I think it's like, I think it's dangerous to say, like, well, is it sin or is it not sin that's causing this? Because ultimately sin is just woundedness. Okay. It's often self-inflicted woundedness, which is how it's spoken of in the East. Sin is spoken of as, like, spiritual suicide, basically. But it's self-inflicted wound, often. But it's like, in all of the cases, we need the divine physician to come and heal this place that's hurting. And that's what confession should be. Confession shouldn't be the place that we go to just say, I'm a bad kid and I need punished and I need to be told that I can move on with my life. It's about saying, I'm broken and I'm hurting and I need you to come and heal my broken heart.
I really like that. I know that in our Byzantine tradition, at funerals and in other places, they talk about God forgiving all sins, voluntary and involuntary. Like, I remember when you said that, that's what came to my mind. And I always thought that was beautiful because we sin and we don't know it. And it's not like, and some of it is maybe just part of the condition we're in. And so I think that approach is actually really good. And I think it aligns too with, again, St. Maximus, who I keep quoting because I just love him. But, where he departed, I don't know if he departed or a little from Evagrius, or if it would have been John Cassian or whatever. And it wasn't quite a departure, but he nuances it, is probably the better way to put it. And to say that our virtue and vice, like virtue is about reordering. Like, in other words, you can be I don't know. It's not just simply a black and white way of thinking about, oh, I'm good or I'm bad, or I do
Mm-hmm.
good things and I'm bad things. It's like the sense in which virtue is a reordering, and it's about a balancing, and it's about properly ordering oneself toward God, and virtues flourish, as opposed to just simply looking at it as, okay, I have this vice and now I have to just impose a good virtue on top of it. No, it's about like the flowering of a virtue,
Mm-hmm.
which I kind of like that approach. I think, and again, it fits with this sort of voluntary involuntary, because it's like, well, I may not even realize 100%. Like, I may not realize, all the consequences of my woundedness and the environment of wound that I live in.
Mm-hmm.
But as I grow in virtue, I am moving out of that. I'm moving into more of a healing space where my virtues will start flowering. I don't know. I feel like that's, tell me if you would know better than me, but like whether that's more the Eastern perspective. I feel like that is just I don't know, a more welcoming or more
Mm-hmm.
warmer kind of approach to the
Mm-hmm.
problem of evil in our world, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And that's very and Saint Maximus is one of the ones I think who talks the most about involuntary sin. So that yeah, I think that's really really consistent. And I agree, it
And
just leaves more space than some of the
yeah,
other approaches.
yeah. I think in the West there may be a parallel in some way between talking about formal sin and material sin, and one
Hmm.
element of material sin would be, you know, that the will wasn't involved, for example,
Mm.
which can diminish culpability and so forth. But
Mm-hmm.
really like that.
I think it's the differences in the West. I mean, there's so much that's we agree on, and probably
Right.
agree essentially on everything, but there's like an emphasis that sort of took place in the West on that, like, legalistic kind of perspective, and we see that
Mm-hmm.
get to its fullest with Protestants, right, and Calvinists, right, and this sort of idea that Christ is like a legal thing that has happened, where
Mm-hmm.
you are no longer acquitted thanks to Christ, right, and it's just seen in those kind of black and white terms, and I think we even have that kind of notion of sin to some extent, generally in Roman Catholicism. But I think the East emphasizes the healing. I think that has influenced the West, like
Mm-hmm.
since probably Vatican II. But we emphasize the healing. It's not just you're on trial
Mm-hmm.
and good for you, you didn't get sent to jail, but you're still bad, right? Like, so you need to, and that whole mentality is just very discouraging. Whereas the mentality in the East is more around healing, right? And I think that's, I don't know, it fits well with an IFS approach, and really approaching all of our parts and
Mm-hmm.
our exiles and seeing them as wounded, seeing our managers and firefighters as burdened. All of a sudden, it's like the whole approach is inner transformation through healing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, I said a
Yeah.
lot there. Hopefully that resonates with both of you.
Yeah, and I think, well, because it's like I think we've talked before, Gerry, about a therapy of spiritual illnesses by
Mm.
Jean-Claude Larcher.
Hmm.
And like, this is the whole concept of, yeah, he starts this very expensive book series, but someone donated it to our monastery and it's really excellent. But he starts by talking about, which I think is really beautiful, he starts by talking about what health looks like and spiritually, and then how the fall affects things, and then how we see the effects manifested in different spiritual illnesses in our lives. And he works through the 8 evil thoughts of Evagrius and Cassian, and then which the 8 evil thoughts are the origin of the 7 deadly sins. But then when St. John Cassian brought them west, then I think it was like there were 2 that were combined and 2 that were combined and 1 that was added. So it went from 8 to 7. And so anyways, but so then he goes through how healing like we need healing in each of these areas, these areas of spiritual illness in our life, which is how sin is always spoken of in the East, is woundedness, is illness, is sickness, and that we need healing in order to be restored to health. And so I think to tie this into parts work, that's why it's so consistent with parts work for me, is all of Eastern spirituality, and maybe also Western. I'm not even saying like as opposed to Western. I'm just, I don't really know Western spirituality. It's a place of great ignorance in my life. But at least in the East, the concept is we are spending our lives, and in some sense all of eternity, being restored to health, being restored to the good image in which we were created, which, like parts work, means it's not about getting rid of things inside of us that were there to begin with. It's about getting those places inside of us back to their unwounded, untraumatized selves. Like there's, if the concept of theosis is becoming God, it means allowing all of our parts to be deified, like you were saying, Gerry, all of our parts and our inmost self, and not thinking that any of the parts in and of themselves are bad. This is part of why I really like Evagrius. I almost said Saint Evagrius, but he's not actually a canonized saint. But this is part of why I like Evagrius so much, is he's one of the places, because we like the people who agree with us, basically. He's one of the places that I see in the fathers that insists that our desires inherently are good desires that become twisted, that become disordered, that become perverted, but inherently are good. There's something good at the core, and that's so intuitive to me, because if God created everything and everything that God created is good, then that must be what evil is, right? Evil isn't a thing in and of itself. Evil is a twisting, a perversion, a lack. It's not something that exists in and of itself separate from good. It's a distortion of good. And I think that's what's happening with our parts, is that they are inherently good. They are seeking a good. And sometimes they seek that good in a disordered way and need to be reordered. Yeah.
Well, that brings me to a question that I come up against a lot. And so I'm a psychologist, so I don't focus primarily on spiritual formation, focus more on human formation. But I wonder if there are differing degrees of union with God across the parts in a single person. So I'm imagining somebody where some of the parts are more integrated than others. Some parts are more, kind of in harmony with the innermost self. Innermost self has a relationship with God. There's some union developing, and in Father Boniface Hicks and Father Thomas Ackland's book, I think it's just wonderful, Personal Prayer, A Guide to Receiving the Father's Love. There's this idea that they bring up of, contemplation starting a lot earlier, union starting much earlier than people might think. It's not just the end of, a whole stage progression of development in the spiritual life. But I'm wondering if some parts might be deeper in union with God than other parts within the same person. I'm just curious. And this is highly speculative, right? We're not going to be able to go to Denzinger, and we're not going to be able to find anything that's going to speak to this directly. But I'm just really wondering what you think.
I don't know how it could be otherwise, honestly. I mean, there are areas in my life, basically the places that are, oh, there's a cat. Basically the places that are less wounded, honestly, those places, those parts within me find it much easier to surrender to the Lord's will, and surrendering to his will is always a place for deeper union, right? And then there are other parts of me that just really struggle to surrender, because it's like, well, I want to surrender here and I want to be in union with here, except I've been burned a lot. And so I don't trust that actually it's safe to surrender.
Well,
Yeah.
I wonder too, our exiled parts don't get access in the same way. Like if they're exiled in our system, they're never brought in right into relationship with God fully. And so the activity of connecting with our exile, right, and that usually can often show up right as some childlike part who's wounded, and bringing that in right into conscious awareness and connecting and attending to that part brings that part into communion with God in a way that it hadn't been. And so right, and so that's part of the beauty of this, is that there's a therapeutic approach of loving our exiles and unburdening them and bringing them into the closer connection, but then there's this spiritual approach which is also bringing them into communion with God. And so if we go through each of our different parts and check in with each part and bring all the exiles in, but we also work with our managers and so on, and they're all being brought into communion with God, each one, and each of their different needs and each of their different concerns and each of their different, sometimes rigid, tough nut situations, right, and maybe even anger at God, right, and different things. And so, but when every part of the system is brought into connection with God in a beautiful new way, isn't that what we're talking about? Like, isn't that theosis, right? Isn't that, or at least a movement toward theosis, like, isn't that what it would be like if our entire inner world was one chorus, one cathedral filled with beautiful singers praising God? Wouldn't that be theosis?
That's a very beautiful image and very poetic. Here's a hot take that just came to me, which is, what if it's the exact opposite of what I just said? And what if the parts of us, this is crazy, this is totally speculative, but what if the parts of us that are most in union with God actually are the exiles, and that the problem is not that those parts aren't in union with God. The problem is that our inmost self, is not in union with those parts. And that's where the disintegration is coming from. Because so the reason I'm wondering this is because I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday. And she and I were really relating in that, in a strange way, the times that I know God's closeness, not even so much as a feeling, but just, like a knowledge, I guess, like a noetic, knowledge, something in the nous, which I think, based on like how the nous is spoken of, I think the nous would really be the inmost self. But the times that I experience, we're good on that? We're solid on that? Okay. The times that I experience noetically his closeness the most in my life are typically the times that I feel alone, that I feel abandoned, that I feel like maybe I'm sick and I feel like no one's caring for me, or something like that. And I don't know if that's where people most experience oneness with God across the board, or if that's because my particular wounds are abandonment wounds. And so I'm wondering if God is particularly close to those exiled parts, because this was what the incarnate God was. Like, Jesus was always seeking out the exiles. He was always seeking out the ones on the margins. He wanted the lepers. He wanted the adulterers. He wanted the exiles. And so so maybe it's not a problem so much of those exiles aren't in union with God. Maybe they are, but maybe we're not letting those exiles into union with ourselves. And I don't know. So that's a hot take.
I love it. You really like that's blowing my mind a little bit conceptually because I tend to like have an inner view of how it works.
Hmm.
But you've added a dimension there that I'm going to definitely sit with and make some kind of sense. Like my understanding, what I've really liked in Eastern Christian writings, in understanding the nous, like you were saying, this sort of the heart, if you will, or the inmost self, the core of the heart, I guess. Um, the way I've read it is that the nous is darkened. So the nous itself
Mm.
is in the image of God, and so in the most pure way, I suppose. And so it is simply good, right? Like it is simply
Hmm.
good at its core, but it's darkened, right? And so that the process of in the East of, especially with the focus on God's energies and light, and
Hmm.
the monks, the Athonite monks, and the experience of light, divine light within, and all that. There's a sense in which then the nous is illuminated, and the darkness surrounding the nous is taken away. So the whole soul kind of like shines, if you will, and so on. So I love all that. But what you're adding as a dimension that is, in my mind, I think wonderfully brilliant and genius would be the fact that if the person, and you can take any person, right? A person who maybe they're disconnected from the church completely and they're living a very difficult life, and their nous is darkened completely. Like they have in their inner world, there's no access to the image of God in the deepest sense, right? The nous is so darkened, and yet what you're saying though is that their exile may actually, like God may be reaching their exile and having a connection there deep within that is actually what may bring them out of darkness ultimately and may bring them into a place that really changes things, right? And that allows then maybe the news to be some little light to get in there, some spark of light. And
Hmm.
isn't that like conversion?
Yeah.
And maybe it's God reaching our exiles on some level that leads to conversion of the heart.
Well, let me ask a question this way. I'm really interested in this, and I love it that we're speculating and just we're kind of turning things around in our own minds and so forth. But I'm wondering if God can be really close to an exile, really close, but the exile not yet experience it.
Hmm.
So I'm making a distinction between closeness and union,
Hmm.
right? Because yes, I mean I totally agree with you, and that whole premise of how Christ, our Lord, has reached out to all the exiles. That's the whole point of the Scripture for Your Inner Outcasts podcast that we do. That's our sister podcast, which is all about working with the daily mass readings and bringing them the good news of the gospel to the outcasts, to the exiles
Hmm.
within us. But I'm wondering also about, like, does God bypass the innermost self though? Is
Mm.
there a respect for the hierarchy within?
Hmm.
One of the things I've noticed clinically, in the very rare cases where I think there might actually be something demonic going on, again, these are very rare.
Hmm.
It's clear to me that at least from these two cases, that Satan was reaching out to the most alienated parts, was
Mm.
wanting to go after the most alienated parts. And again, I don't tend to focus on this stuff, so I'm speaking outside of my area of expertise.
Sure.
My sense is that God really wants to respect the dignity of the human person and not necessarily work on just a part by part basis, not to approach multiple parts independently,
Mm.
without an organizing sort of kind of hierarchy inside.
Hmm.
And so I wonder about that. I wonder, though, that I'm really impressed by this pastor, Protestant pastor Charles Finney, back in the 19th century. He talked about like the childlike qualities that get us to heaven. These 15 qualities, and he listed them all out. They were beautiful. Those are held like primarily by our exiles. So there's a need for those exiles to be incorporated. So I don't know. I'm just trying to weigh all of this. And again, sort of think through it. But like, especially when it comes to connecting with God? Can a part, another way to say this would be, can a part have an experience of union with God, actually be in union with God without being in a unity with the innermost self?
I
Like
I
that,
think
that
that's
seems
an
hard
important
for me.
that's an important distinction I think you're making, and I think you're probably right. I don't think we're talking about union in the sense of theosis like we've been
Okay.
trying to get at.
Mm-hmm.
At least, and Mother, you tell me if you agree, because I think it's more an experience of some kind of God's presence, an experience
Okay.
that the exile feels like they're not alone,
Mm-hmm.
and that God is with them, and that they're loved in a way that the rest of the system doesn't know. And that leads them to an opening in the inmost self and maybe other parts to an opening up toward God, which then eventually would lead to theosis. So we're not talking about theosis, right? We're actually
Okay.
really talking about moments of conversion, I think,
Mm-hmm.
an early illumination, very early.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we were using the same language, and I think it was an imprecision of language. So I'm grateful for that clarification. I think Peter, the word closeness that you used is probably a better word than union. I think I am because here's the other reason. I think when we experience union with God, I think, I'm not there for the record, but I think when we experience union with God, we more clearly know the reality of our goodness, and we know more clearly ourselves as we are in union with him. And that's not the experience I'm talking about with these parts.
Okay.
Like
Yeah, that
these
would make
exiled
sense.
parts, because
Right.
these exiled parts, even feeling that closeness, still are exiled, still are burdened,
Right.
still are full of self-hatred and all of these things. And I don't think we experience those things so tragically and so deeply when we're in having a moment of real union with the Lord. We're not experiencing that self-hatred and that
Right.
self-rejection. And so I think you're right that it's not a union that I'm talking about with these exiled parts, though that was the word I was using. I think closeness is the better word.
Okay. That
Yeah.
So I have a good boy part that really is like my spiritual manager that really like is terrified about leading anyone astray. Like and I will encourage people, like, if you hear any of our audience, if you hear anything that's that's off, and let us know. Like if there's concerns about something's, we don't want to shy away from
Yeah.
really getting into these questions. It's helpful to us if you can refer to, the Catechism or to Ludwig Gott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma or Denzinger or something to kind of give us a basis. I don't really want to hear, well, 12 years ago I heard a homily where a priest said that and it contradicted what you said. That's not super helpful to us, but we're really open to being corrected and to issuing corrections. But then so there's kind of this whole self-correcting effort together that you all are included in. But I love it that we're exploring this stuff, and so yeah, that really helps me, helps my my good boy part. Like, okay, good, okay, because it's also a little disorienting to my evaluator part, which is my part of me that's really about thinking. Like, I always thought that we had to have unity within in order to have union with God. That was something that Anthony Flood was really bringing out in his work, both on the podcast here, but in his books. That union with another is really predicated on unity within, which would be maybe a really Western thing, obviously being so Thomistic in that. But
I had a thought. I don't know if this would just lead us into other waters that would be interesting, but is the Eastern distinction between essence and energies?
Oh,
Yes. And, well,
now, if
because
you are listening to this and you're not watching it on YouTube, you have got to see the expressions from Mother Natalia and Gerry here as they interact. Like, this is just priceless. So.
Well, because there is a distinction that's made in the East
yeah.
that I think is actually helpful in some of these areas, because especially with theosis, because of course we know that, God's essence is different from ours. Like, we're not the same. So, So that's obvious. So becoming deified or becoming, you know, made into God. We're not made into his essence, right? So that's clear. But the idea that his energies is something we can participate in, and that those energies are experienced like grace, or just maybe the experience of love, and monks talk about the experience of light. It kind of allows us to participate in the divine nature through his energies, when in fact his essence would be just overwhelming, like just impossible to. We would just be destroyed. We would just be his essence is too much, kind of. But his energies is kind of like the sun ray, the light. He's the sun. If we were thrown into the middle of the sun, we would just burn up and die. But we can feel his energies, which is like the warmth of the sunlight on our skin, and that's how we, as human beings, can experience him. And so that's an east-west, slightly different way of expressing it. I thought I would throw that into the discussion here.
So I don't know if you've heard of Saint Maximus the Confessor, but he
Tell me about this guy.
So he says these are two of his statements from his first century on love. Century, like in the Philokalia, there are collections of 100 texts, which are called centuries. So this is numbers 95 and 96 from his first century. This is 95. When the sun rises and casts its light on the world, it reveals both itself and the thing it illumines. Similarly, when the sun of righteousness rises in the pure intellect, he reveals both himself and the inner principles of all that has been and will be brought into existence by him. And this is 96. We do not know God from his essence. We know him, rather, from the grandeur of his creation and from his providential care for all creatures. For through these, as though they were mirrors, we may attain insight into his infinite goodness, wisdom, and power. So I think that I'm very not well versed in the essence and energies debate, which is why, and this is like a hot debate, and I'm just not an intellectual, so I don't even get involved in the debates. But my understanding of it is what you just described, Gerry, and what St. Maximus the Confessor seems to be saying to me here is that, like, basically we see God through a mirror. We see his thumbprint on things. And so we can kind of deduce backwards based on the thumbprint. But we don't experience his essence. We know him through his creation, basically, because that's the only way we can know him in our limited human minds.
But I would also, though, say that we know him through his energies through prayer, right? Like we could experience grace in prayer that is like light that is shining on us and within us, and that
which is what he's talking about in 95. And
so I love that, and to get to the Philokalia as well, like which I love that you brought up, and all that, and because a lot of people don't know what that is, which is a collection of writings from very early, like Desert Fathers and other early monks that most of them I think went out into the deserts and stuff, and their writings were captured and put down, and so it's just a wealth of insight and so on. It can be a little rigorous for some because these were pretty tough guys women that we just this podcast is probably coming out a lot later. We just celebrated Mary of Egypt, and so there were women also who went out into the desert. So they were really deep into experiencing the inner world, right, and experiencing like the desert, and going out into the desert is almost like going into the unconscious, right? It's and all that might be dangerous there, if you will, and working through things, so I want to like mention this sort of Greek term nepsis, which comes.
I was just about to bring that up.
You were.
Great. Yes.
Yeah.
That's so great.
Well, so tell me
I
about
was very far from bringing it up, so I'm glad that you.
I was actually not going to use the word nepsis, so that's great. I didn't even think to use the Greek word, so that was great. But
well, tell me your understanding. So this sort of watchfulness, right? Like this sense of inner attention.
Yeah. So watchfulness is the word that I was thinking because. So yeah, this is huge in the East. This concept of watchfulness, it's all over the Philokalia, and it's the concept of guarding the heart. And so, basically, and I think the concept of watchfulness, in my limited understanding of parts work, is very, very consistent with parts work, because the concept is we should be attentive to the thoughts that are trying to enter our hearts, and ideally notice them as soon as they appear, and either reject them as bad or receive them into our heart as good. And so it's about a discernment of spirits, and guarding the heart from invasion. And I think that the reason I find this so consistent with parts work is it's like, as we are purifying ourselves of those thoughts that are actually harmful, and not helpful for our inmost self, I think that very much is the unburdening of the parts. And that's the not allowing, it's like, you've probably talked about Inside Out on the podcast, I assume. Okay. So it's in Inside Out 2 when Riley starts to have the negative thoughts that go down to do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
That they're kind of like wonky and not lit up. And again, it's that concept of the lighting up of the truths within us. Like, I would say that's the energies, is those positive connections are illuminated because they are experiencing the truth of the Lord. And then these other ones that are wonky and you pluck them and there's discord and all of that, like, these are the thoughts that we need to cut off as they're entering the heart. And so really, in a sense, this is what all of the monastic life is meant to be. I don't live it well, but I think I'm growing in it, is this increasing nepsis, this increasing watchfulness in our lives. And there's a little bit of, it also reminds me a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy, because so one of my spiritual daughters, for instance, she was telling me at some point that she realized that she struggled with a particular sin. Let's say it's gluttony, because it wasn't gluttony. So this spiritual daughter won't know I'm talking about her. And the thing is, she had realized she had struggled with gluttony her whole life, and only in the past few years realized that she was being gluttonous. And I was like, okay, first of all, that's a huge step of you realize that it's happening. And then I said, okay, well, what we need to work towards is, as soon as you realize you're being gluttonous, then cut yourself off from the gluttony. And then over time, she just was able to shorten that reaction time. And I really think this is, in a sense, like a practical application of Nepsis, is she realized earlier and earlier that she was reaching gluttony, until she got to the point where she realized that she was approaching gluttony before she actually was gluttonous, and was able to cut it off there. And I think that's the concept of watchfulness, is like cutting the things off before they even enter the heart, and before we even act on them. And I think it's like stopping our parts from being burdened, So there's the unburdening that needs to happen, but then there's also a watchfulness of guarding our parts from being reburdened or burdened anew.
Well, I
So,
think you said it really well there. Like I think you're talking about self-awareness principally, right? In this nepsis or watchfulness, because if you're not aware of your own inner world, first of all, then like you said, you're not even going to know that there's gluttony. You're not even going to think about it that way. So you're not even aware of it, which is the first step. I mean, there are other steps when you talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, or for that matter, parts work. I mean, they would at least be somewhat similar in saying like the burden might be I'm not good enough, or I could never, I'm never satisfied or something, or I can never be satisfied, or I don't know, whatever the in CBT language might be the negative belief or the, cognitive distortion or whatever. But those in IFS terms, right? Like those negative beliefs and cognitive distortions are burdens that part is carrying. And so what the Nepsis does, what the watchfulness does, is it allows you to see it and catch it and be aware, like first of all, aware of it and catch it, as opposed to just automatically giving into it, automatically just living it out without thought, without awareness, without consciousness. So it really is the sense of looking deep within. I understand it right.
Yeah.
so almost
yeah.
everything that Dr. Gerry, everything I know about Eastern, sort of Eastern thought within Catholicism has come from Dr. Gerry and his recommendations and so forth. So I'm coming at this kind of really from the outside perspective. So when it comes to Nepsis, are we being watchful both inwardly and outwardly? Sort of the language was something coming into my heart. But my understanding is that if it's coming from a part, if it's an impulse or a desire, or it's already in your heart, like it, because of the way that we think about, at least Dr. Gerry, that you've described in your book, with that diagram on page 300, that the parts are in the heart. So I make a distinction between an impulse, which comes from a part, and a temptation, which would come from outside the person, from a demon or something like that. So I'm curious about, like, with this concept of nepsis and of cutting off, are we silencing like a desire of a part? Are we simply saying, nope, we're not going to allow that? Or, because then that might sound a little bit more like suppression or denial, if it's coming from inside of us. Or are we really only saying those are for things that are coming from outside of us, from other people or from demons or, some other place?
Well, I think, so first of all, would you say, Gerry, that the parts are like within the nous even? Like, are the parts within the inmost self?
No, I would say the parts, yeah.
So when I say guarding the heart, I think I mean like guarding that nous, basically. Like before the like when the thoughts come, basically as soon as the thoughts come, maybe I say into our mind, maybe that would be a better, like not letting those thoughts even reach our parts or the inmost self.
I would, this is how I would frame it, if right off the cuff here, would be that it's more like something happens, like somebody walks by with popcorn that's buttered and salted and it smells so good, right? I love popcorn. And all of a sudden, it's not that the popcorn has suddenly from the outside invaded you with a thought. It's that now you have a part that's responding to that. And if the part's belief is, I can't survive without popcorn or something, or I have to have everything that comes my way, or I'm never going to have anything. Who knows where it even comes from? But if there's a burden kind of there, that is basically where that part would kind of take over the system, so to speak. In ego state therapy, it would be like would enter the executive, right? Almost like replace the inmost self, if you will, and make decisions. Then you're kind of that would be like the giving in. So the negative beliefs and the thoughts like, oh, I must have that popcorn. It doesn't matter if I have to like, push an old lady out of the way to get it. I'm going to get that popcorn. Well, that is coming from within, right? Nobody on the outside. I mean, unless maybe there's a demon encouraging or something from the outside, but the real negative thing is coming from within, from that part. And so the Nepsis would be like, oh, an awareness, like all that can happen, and we're not even thinking about it. We're just, before we know it, we're just gulping down popcorn. Right? And so the Nepsis is like,
can you gulp popcorn?
I can. That's great. Yeah. Wolfing is a better word, right? So Nepsis is about slowing all that down, right? And having the self-awareness to go, wait a second, and catching the part, understanding where the part's coming from. Like that's where it fits in so well with parts work, I think. And being able to like attend to it and not just give in to those thoughts that are just sort of taking over. Does that address what you're asking, Peter?
I think so. I guess what I was thinking about as I was listening to this was wondering if there was an apparent contradiction between what we were saying earlier about, how all intentions are good. There's a good intentionality behind all parts. And so if there is a thought like, I need popcorn, I need, a big 5-gallon bucket of popcorn, I'm going to eat all that popcorn. Is there an interest in Nepsis of understanding what the good intention is behind that? Is there, an awareness of like, I feel really empty. I feel like, I feel like there's nothing inside. I need something inside to know that I'm even existing. In an extreme case, for example, popcorn can help me with that. Or is it more like, no popcorn for you? Like, no popcorn for me. Like, that's not what we're going to do, because that would be unhealthy. It would, desecrate the temple of the Holy Spirit or whatever that I am, that kind of that my body is, so I'm just kind of trying to understand it, because it could sound a little harsh. Like, we're just going to cut that thought off, and my guess, my question was, parts of me were saying, well, will we still be listened to?
Yeah. So I think if I can give a practical example of this in my own life, within my monastic life,
Sure.
An example of an area that I think has been an increased watchfulness and an increased self-awareness in my own life is, it could be, so I get very short with my sisters. Like I get very snippy, at various points. And this used to happen a lot more frequently. And this is, I guess, why I was thinking of cognitive behavioral therapy, because I think this is an example that fits in very well there, but it also fits in with unburdening parts. So as time went on and I started opening those things up in prayer, which I think that's part of it, is I think sometimes we need to say in the moment, no popcorn for you.
Right,
and then we need to later sit down and say, why did I want popcorn? Where was that coming from? And kind of explore that. And it's not always safe to do that exploration in the moment. But so as time went on and I started seeing this pattern in my life of these times that I would get really snippy with my sisters, then as I prayed through those things, I started to see, I was getting snippy because these other things had happened that day with my sisters. And all of those things that happened with my sisters conveyed the message to me, or maybe they didn't convey the message, but I received the message, that I'm unseen and I'm unwanted in this community. And so this was very clearly a part of me that was feeling unseen, and then was being snippy because at least someone will see me, even if they see me because they're hurt. And they'll acknowledge that there's some need here. And as this went on, I started to, as soon as I felt the snippiness rising and like this anger rising in me, I'm able, more frequently, not always, I'm able to cut off, because here's the thing, like, so Elder Thaddeus, there's a book called Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives by Elder Thaddeus, which is an excellent book. But the concept basically is, all of our temptations and all of our actions are preceded by a thought, whether or not we're conscious of the thought. So for instance, in this particular example that I'm giving, the thought is I'm unseen, or the belief, or whatever it is. And so as I'm able to stop that thought, that's right, our thoughts determine our lives. Look at that smile. Doesn't he have such a sweet smile?
He's a very adorable. Yes, very adorable.
Then the point is, like, as soon as the thought is entering my heart of you are not seen, cut it off before it enters the heart, because that's just not a truth, and that's just a burden. So in some sense, it's like cutting off those things that burden our parts, and being able to act more out of our integrated, unburdened selves. Is that a practical example that kind of clarifies it a little bit?
I think so, and I think that's very helpful. I'm going to throw out. I had to look it up, so I'm not going to pretend I'm so brilliant that I could just spew this out. But I looked it up real quickly. Some of these terms, and there's Nepsis, and then there's prosake, which is like it's the deliberate directing of the nous inward. So it takes it. So Nepsis is the watchfulness. A little bit of the sobriety, the vigilance. And then the prosake is the deliberately turning the nous inward. Then you have hesychia, right? Hesychism, which is interior silence, which allows the nous to perceive God. And then there's apatheia, right? Which is, it's not emotional deadness or indifference. It's the freedom of the soul from the tyranny of the disordered passions, which then leads to diakrisis, is the ability to distinguish between thoughts that come from God, from the self, and from the enemy. And then there's metanoia, right, which is a total reorientation of the nous toward God. So in this Greek tradition, in this Eastern tradition, these terms, watchfulness is just the beginning. It's just like this awareness, this sobriety, like being sober enough to notice, and then there's all these different stages of approaches, and they don't strike me as repression, right? We're not suppressing emotions. We're opening up our hearts to God. We're reorienting toward the nous in order to then properly discern what is good and what is not, and what would be healthy or not, and then to be able to have them. I love the word metanoia, right? Because it is a reorientation of the heart. And anyway, so I just say there's this whole process, Peter's point, that isn't. I don't see it as repression.
Okay, that's great. And it is so classic to ask Gerry a question and to get 7 Greek terms in response. Like, that is.
Well, if I can give one more Greek term, I think that the concept here also is, like with Nepsis, the most common way in which it's thought of, I think, is with regards to the logismoi, which means like little thoughts. Basically, they're the thoughts that enter in, and I will say, because it's almost always spoken of as though the logismoi are always bad. They're always from the devil, or at least from ourselves. But there are a few times in the Philokalia that the fathers will talk about certain logismoi that can be neutral or that can even be good. And so I don't think... So anyways, usually when you hear... I just want people to know the context of, usually when you hear the word logismoi, people are talking about unhealthy, unholy thoughts that enter the mind. And these are the things specifically that we're cutting off, and as they enter the heart. And which I think... Yeah, I think, just to go back to your point, Peter, one more time, I think it's a matter of not saying, like, not rejecting the desire for popcorn. Well, maybe rejecting the desire for popcorn, but not rejecting the good desire within that desire for popcorn, which is actually the desire to receive that which fills me with joy. And like, that's a good desire. And I think that's why there's a good desire inherent below even what's maybe disordered. So it's kind of like rejecting the disorder and allowing the other part in is kind of how
So I'm actually thinking about this. Okay, how can we make it maybe more accessible to people's daily lives? And I'm sort of thinking about it as like, how do we work with children? How do we work with children, maybe 3 years old, maybe 5 years old, with an intense desire for something that isn't good, or with an intense impulse, or some other intense experience? Because we don't want to just say, well, yes, anything goes. All parts are good. We're just going to embrace everything. And that's not what we're talking about here, it sounds like. It sounds like there is a balance between setting some limits and boundaries and, but then also a real attempt to try to understand, to attune, going back to even the example that you gave, right? For parts to be seen, heard, known, and understood, which is the second condition of secure attachment, according to Brown and Elliott, their book, Attachment Disturbances in Adults, which you just loved, right? That the desire parts have to be seen, heard, known, and understood. And again, you see that in kids too. I worked in daycare for a while, and we're going to get attention one way or another, right? If it can't be positive and proactive, we're going to get it in a reactive way from those around us. So that makes total sense. That makes total sense to me.
And I think with children, as well as with ourselves. So I actually did, in my very elementary understanding of parts work, I actually did an episode on my own podcast recently called Parts Work and Prayer. And I was just sharing an experience. I had told Gerry recently that I just had this thing in my own life that for months was deeply bothering me. I mean, like when I thought of this thing, this very insignificant thing in the grand scheme of life, and when I thought of it, I was sick to my stomach. I wanted to cry. It was like I was having a trauma response to this seemingly insignificant thing, like so intense. And I was like, and I tried everything to process this. I'd gone to spiritual direction and I tried praying through it, and I kept telling myself to just get over it. Weird, that doesn't work. And finally I was like, all right, I'm going to do the parts work thing because I don't know what else to do here. And so I went to prayer and I prayed one of Gerry's litanies, and then, and I prayed some Jesus prayers and just kind of settled my heart. And then I brought this situation to mind and I was like, whatever part is hurting, like I just invite you to step forward. And 5 parts stepped forward. And I was like, well, this is why it's so intense. And so for the next hour and a half, 2 hours, I just speak to each of these parts with the Lord in prayer, which was very beautiful. But anyways, in that episode, all of that was to just say this, anyways, it was superfluous. But in that episode, I talked about one of the gifts, I think, of a parts work approach within prayer is that, at least for me, most of my parts are like little girl versions of myself. And even if they're not a little girl version, the speaking to the parts with compassion and gentleness is such an important part of parts work, that it's like we all have the little kid inside of us that's stomping their feet and wailing and screaming for attention, and we can approach that part, if we think we're talking to a child, much more easily than if we're talking to ourselves as adults, because we're just so much harsher with ourselves than we are with that little child part. And so it gives us the opportunity to speak to ourselves in the way that we actually need to be spoken to. I was thinking of this, even Peter, when you were talking about the 2 demonic situations that you've had, because Evagrius says there's scarcely any other virtue which the demons fear as much as gentleness. And I'm like, I think that's a huge part of why parts work is so effective, because the very gentleness with which we approach our parts casts out demons. And I think that's Like, that's the same approach that we take with children, I guess, is what was making me think that is, it's not helpful to just say, why do you want popcorn, you idiot? That's like, that's going to go straight to your hips. And what's your problem? What's helpful is to say, like, what are you actually wanting beneath the popcorn? I had a therapist that I know here in the Cleveland area he shared with me one time that when he has, and this speaks to what you were saying, Peter, also of like, we're not just saying like all parts are good, anything goes, whatever, but he would say when he had like an adolescent come to him who was cutting or some kind of self-harm, he doesn't just say to them, you need to stop that. Cutting is bad. And because that's what this adolescent is hearing from everyone else in their lives, right? But he typically approaches it from, okay, well, if you've been doing this, there must be something helpful about that for you. Like, what is the good that you're receiving from this? Like, how is this helping you with life? And then when they say, whatever the things are, then it's like, I'm glad that you've had, like, that you've been helped. I'm glad that you've had this good in your life. If I can suggest to you some other ways that we might be able to achieve those same goods, would you be willing to try it? And I'm like, that's brilliant. That's unburdening. That's talking to the part and saying, like, you're looking for something good here. You're trying to get a good. How can we get that good in a healthy, ordered way?
That's brilliant. That's exactly what we do when we ally with the part and we understand its intention, and then we offer it. Then then the part is working with us.
Well, and if a part was to come back and say as the good that's being sought, because cutting is something that freaks people out, like totally, parents, and it's understandable, teachers, that is something that just like, wow. But if you understood that it's not just, if we take it out of the frame of it's just it's just physical disfigurement, right? But if the part were to come back and say, I feel so dead, I'm not sure I'm alive. The only way that I know I'm alive is when I see the blood flow. Then I know that I'm alive. Then I'm reassured that I'm still alive, which would go to the first primary integrity need in the way that I think about this of survival, right? Like it's a reality check for the part. Well, all of a sudden you've got a very different frame for this, right?
Yeah.
Other than, what sometimes people say, oh, it's a call for attention or whatever, there's ways that we can kind of devalue what the good is that's being sought. And then we can approach it not at the level of the symptom, because I look at cutting as a symptom. And that doesn't mean it's not a problem. A fever of 105 is a symptom, but it's also a problem in its own right. A fever of 107 can kill you, right? So it's not that we're saying there's not a problem there. But I don't want to treat a fever. I want to understand what's causing the underlying, underlying that's causing the fever, right? And I think so much of our approach in psychology is unfortunately focused on symptoms. And if you went into an emergency room with a high fever and with abdominal pain, and they gave you painkillers and Tylenol to reduce the fever, but they didn't ever address the appendicitis, like they're not helping you, right? They're not helping you there. And so we're trying to get to what's at depth. And that's exactly what you were bringing out in such a beautiful way, Mother Natalia.
Which I've one of the most powerful experiences I've had of conversion and healing in my own life was a similar situation where I was battling a particular habitual sin for like 20 years. And whenever this thought entered my mind, and it started when I was a kid. And so I was just so angry. Like for 20 years, I was begging the Lord to relieve me of this pattern of thinking. And I was so angry that he wouldn't. And I remember in August of 2023, I was reading the story of the leper who says, Lord, if you will it, you can make me clean. And he says, I will it, be clean. And I was so angry. I almost threw my Bible, and I was like, I'm your bride. Why don't you want me to be clean? And I'm furious. And And then a couple of months later, I was on retreat with Father Boniface, actually, and we were unpacking some things in this retreat that were totally unrelated, in my mind, to this pattern of thought for 20 years. And at the end of the week, I realized I hadn't had a single one of those thoughts all week. And then a week goes by and still nothing. And then a few weeks goes by and still nothing. And now 3 years go by, still nothing. And it's just like that. It was just gone. And I realized this is the mercy of God that doesn't always feel like mercy to us because we don't know what mercy actually is. He, in his mercy, wasn't healing what I was asking him to heal, because what I didn't realize is I was asking him to take away the spots of leprosy, and he wanted to heal the actual disease, which is what you're saying, Peter. Like, he didn't want to just get rid of the symptoms. He wanted to heal what was at the root. And if he had answered my prayer in the way that I wanted and gotten rid of the spots of leprosy, I wouldn't have dug deeper, because I would have thought I'm fine. And this would have just continued festering within me.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Mother Natalia, but Dr. Gerry and I are old enough to remember cars that if you knew which fuses to remove, you could make the dash lights go out. So if your engine light was on and you reached under the dash and you could pull that fuse, the engine light would go out. The symptom is gone.
And you can tell yourself everything's fine now.
Everything's fine now. Exactly. I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis, pain is God's megaphone, right? And he only allows something to continue in order to be able to draw greater good from it. In Romans 8:28, right? And so, but I would like to get this back into, we've got some time left yet to kind of bring this back to not so much recovery, not so much healing, but back to union with God. Like, if we could bring this into the realm of, as you say, Dr. Gerry, so often flourishing or thriving, right? How might there be some really practical things that might help us?
Before we get practical, I'm going to throw out a few Greek terms.
Obviously.
And just to make the connections between East and West too, and that they're not always so different. Like the term theoria, for example, in the East is really contemplation, right? Which is something that we've been doing, right, at Souls and Hearts, and I know I have, like, to look at how is making that IFSU turn, how does that related to contemplation? Like, how is that related to prayer? How is that related to connecting with God? How is our inner world connected to God? And we're just always asking these questions. And so the Greek concept of theoria is about having a spiritual perception, a vision of God, right? They would see it as his uncreated light, but whatever. So it's this deep contemplation. But then there's the word ecstasis, which I think we get ecstatic from ecstasy, right? Which is sort of standing outside oneself, the soul transcending the ordinary mode to encounter God. And when I hear that, like, I just think, like, wow, like, that fits so much of, I know when we go deeper inward, like, we can do this inner work therapeutically, and that's amazing. But then in that space, even going deeper and with the inmost self and connecting with God and contemplation and prayer, we actually, like, experience something where we're outside of ourselves, and we have this deeper experience of then illumination of God's light shining on our nous, our inmost self, in a way that is transformative. And I think that all leads to theosis. And so, okay, so I say all that, and maybe there's comment on that, but be practical about it. I mean, it is deep prayer, and we need to spend time, and not just spending time in prayer where we're, like, just saying our prayers, or just saying things, or talking to God, and or asking for things, but it's this deep experience, right? And we're not going to live our lives, unless we're Mother Natalia at her monastery, we're not going to be living our lives 24/7 in this state. I know I'm being a little facetious. I know you don't do that either, but you might do it more than me. I don't know, but we can have
Maybe.
this like experience at least every day to touch base with that,
Mm-hmm.
right? To at least pause and Nepsis, the watchfulness, the quieting, the entering, the theoria, the entering contemplation, the going deeper, going inward, connecting with our inner parts, connecting with our, our inmost self, and bringing our whole attention to God. And I know that sounds lofty, but it isn't so hard in some ways. Like it is, He'll give the grace that we need. So it may be dry sometimes, but He'll provide the grace to, at times, for us to really be kind of taken outside of ourselves. Anyway, I know I said a lot, and you're the mother, you're the nun. So you tell me, you tell me what you heard in that, or what spoke to you in that, or what you would add to that.
Well, I think, like, is this a good time for me to give my practical takeaway? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So, yeah, because I think my practical takeaway would be very much what you just said, Gerry, of we are so steeped in our Western world, and I don't mean Western Christian, I mean Western world, Western society. We're so steeped in this obsession with productivity and doing all the time, and this seeps into even our monastic life here, and it's something that we are constantly coming back to, of like trying to reorder our lives to be more about being than doing. But this happens even in our spirituality, of like, I think we as in every Christian, we often go to prayer with some kind of goal, and like prayer is supposed to be productive. Either I'm going to have this great insight from it, or even I'm going to have good feelings from it. I'm going to receive some grace from it, or I'm going to, if you ask some people, why do you pray every day? People who do pray every day, they might say, well, it gives me strength to get through the day. But like, even that is not really the reason that we should go to prayer.
It's very
the
utilitarian.
reason, yes,
Yeah,
the reason
yeah.
we go to prayer should be simply for the sake of union with God. Like, we go to prayer for the sake of relationship, not for the sake of receiving from. And there are byproducts. We do receive. We do get strength for the day. We do receive those insights sometimes. We do get graces sometimes. But like, that's not the point. Those are the byproducts of the relationship. And so the practical takeaway that I would say is we need to go to prayer and simply be in His presence. It's what you were talking about so many times during this episode, Gerry, of we need to just bask in the sun. We need to receive the light and let Him illuminate the things inside of ourselves, not just coming to Him with problems within ourselves that we want Him to solve, because I think we can go to Him as life coach instead of life giver. And yeah, so I think my practical takeaway would be we need to spend time in prayer simply being with Him. Yeah.
I have a practical takeaway.
Well, can I comment on this practical takeaway
yes.
first? Because
Yes,
it just
please.
brings up my favorite G.K. Chesterton quote, where he says, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And I'm just going to encourage people to pray badly. To just, I liken it to breathing, right? Would you rather breathe badly or not breathe at all? Because those are kind of your choices with this whole, when we're struggling with this thing. And just was reflecting on, my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. As high as the heavens are above the earth are my ways above your ways, and my thoughts above your thoughts. We don't really know how to evaluate all this stuff very clearly, So some of it is just approaching in trust. Yeah. Just that emphasis on being with just made my heart sing too, because we talk a lot about the importance of being with. Don't just do something, stand there, just be with. So thank you for that.
I love that. So my practical takeaway is to get a cat. I'm going to explain why. I think you saw one of them show up. We have two, and there's one. Her name is Nebula, and in the morning I have a little prayer room. Dr. Peter, you've been there, and
Absolutely.
so I go there in the morning. I've been doing the 19th annotation, which is like spiritual exercises over the course of a year, and so I have like things I'm supposed to do, like have these prayers and Bible readings and stuff. Plus, I do some of the Melkite morning prayer, but I also do the readings from the Roman breviary as well. So I'm doing like all these things. Well, and so I've got the books, right? Like I've got the books. I've
You're
got the
breathing with
Bible.
so many lungs.
I have so many, yes. And I've got all these different books, and they're sitting there, and I go to this one, and then I read from the scriptures, and I've got my Word on Fire Gospel Bible, which I absolutely love. And and I got all these things. And then what happens, and I have lit my candles, got my incense going. So I'm like sitting in my prayer room with all these things to do. And then my cat walks in. And then she comes in, and then she jumps on. You'll see why. I call her my little paraclete for a reason. She jumps on my chest and starts purring, and I'm petting her, and I can no longer read from any of the books. I can't pick it, because if I pick up a book, she'll go away or something. So she forces me to just stop and just, maybe I've read a little bit or I've done some of the prayers, and then just sit with it and just sit with God. And like, okay, Gerry, stop just trying to get all this stuff done in your prayer time and actually just sit with God. So that's why I'm not saying you really do need to get a cat, but my cat at least has shown me what it means to just stop being so busy and just sit with God, which is an amazing little gift.
So when I think about theosis, when I think about deification, and we haven't talked about it a lot today, but I think the takeaway that I'd like to emphasize is the way parts are going to look at that is going to be directly correlated with the way they look at God, with their God images. And these are the sort of felt, intuitive, often nonverbal, sort of gut sense of who God is. And they're formed by experience and how parts make sense of experience, especially of authority figures, especially if those authority figures had some kind of Catholic or Christian connotation to them. Parents, coaches, priests, teachers. And I'm really gonna go back to a theme we had before: gentleness, but also patience and kindness with parts. Because parts sometimes just need some practice being in relationship. And I'm less focused on parts experiencing God immediately than I am on them experiencing love. Because sometimes parts need to be able to take in love, to learn something about the nature, something about the essence of God, before they are equipped to be able to approach God. Because that could be so scary, especially if God is angry, God is distant, God is abandoning, God is rejecting, whatever the God image is. And so I think one of the things that we really want to appreciate, I use the example of refeeding syndrome. There's a medical condition where people have been starving. And so the natural inclination with somebody that's gone without food for 10 days might be, let's get this person a full meal. They need calories, they need nutrition, they need vitamins and minerals. So big, full 5-course meal. But if you do that, you'll kill them. Because they no longer have the enzymes in their stomach. They don't have the gut flora to be able to digest it. That has to be sort of built up. So you start with like sugar water, the very easiest things to digest. So kind of thinking about what is milk for parts. And, it can be a really threatening thing for parts that believe that they have to encounter God. They might need to really have an experience of trust with someone who can sort of be like that go-between or a bridge. So that could be the innermost self. It could be a different spiritual intercessor like St. Joseph or Our Lady, so just a lot of that we don't try to rush that process so much, and that we really be introducing parts to love And in learning and in learning what love is and experiencing love, they're coming to know God, because as St. John tells us, right, God is love. So so just some patience with that process, I guess, would be my takeaway. So
I love
Thank
it.
you. Mm-hmm.
Is there any word, Mother, I think we're getting close to the end here, that you would offer a word of encouragement to someone who's carrying deep wounds and struggles, maybe to believe that theosis, is possible for them?
Actually, there was something else that what was it? There was something that I saw. Somewhere in the Philokalia, someone says, probably St. Maximus or Evagrius, says that basically the Holy Spirit is unafraid to approach us even when we are still impure, and that he is still gentle with us even when we are impure. And what the author means by impure, right, is still steeped in sin. But I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make in our spiritual life is thinking that I need to get to this place in order to encounter God. I need to have, or in order to encounter love, as Peter's saying. Like, I need to have this nice wrapped up package that I can present, and that's when I can encounter him. Even in confession, I think oftentimes in confession or spiritual direction, we bring the things once we feel like we've kind of figured them out, or once we feel like we've gotten past it, instead of like encountering love in the midst of the mess that we are. I gave a talk, which is available on YouTube. I think it's the best talk I've ever given to the Columbus Catholic Women's Conference, 3,000 women, which was terrifying. But the name of the talk was A Beginner's Guide to Riding Your Hot Mess Express into Heaven. Because the reality is we're all a hot mess, but we think that we need to not be a hot mess in order to be holy. And it's like, actually, the Lord wants our sanctity, and he wants relationship now in the midst of the hot mess. And I think that would be my encouragement, is don't let your hot mess, don't let your woundedness discourage you from being with him. Because like we talked about with the exiles, like that actually makes you his favorite. He loves the hot messes. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much. I need to hear that. I think so many people probably do need to hear that today.
Mm-hmm.
And we will link to that in the description of in our YouTube description and on the podcast platforms as well, so you can take that in.
Great.
If this has piqued your interest, if you'd like to learn more about internal family systems and parts work grounded in a Catholic understanding of the human person, check out episodes 157, 158, 159 of this Interior Integration for Catholics podcast. It's a great introduction, and you can learn so much. It's like a little mini course, episodes 157, 158, 159. And the Resilient Catholics community in Souls and Hearts is all about you flourishing and thriving on your journey of deification, your journey of theosis, of participating in God's divine nature, of embracing your identity as a beloved little son of God or a beloved little daughter of God. We set our sights high. And we go about it in a way that is so different than so many other Catholic outreaches, so many Catholic apostolates or ministries. We focus on first things first. We focus on human formation. St. John Paul II described human formation as the basis of all formation. The other three dimensions of personal formation, intellectual formation, spiritual formation, pastoral formation, these all depend on human formation. And so in the RCC, in the Resilient Catholics community, we focus on your human formation arithmetic so that you can better do your spiritual algebra. We're shoring up that natural foundation for the spiritual life. And now the Resilient Catholics community, the RCC, is open for new members all during the month of June. We open to new applications every February, June, and October. So if you're a Catholic who sees how important structure is for your personal human formation, if you want to overcome the natural level obstacles to sharing deeply in God's divine nature as his beloved little son or beloved little daughter, and if parts and systems thinking, if that'll make sense to you, consider applying to the Resilient Catholics community. The RCC offers you that structured program over the course of a year in a community of like-minded Catholics, in small groups, flourishing and thriving as we journey together toward loving God wholeheartedly with all of our parts, and as we journey toward loving our neighbors as ourselves. Go to our landing page at soulsandhearts.com/RCC and sign up if you're interested. Hundreds of Catholics have already found the RCC to be helpful in their human formation. We use the best of both secular and spiritual resources to help you experience what love is at a bones level across all your parts. Right? Again, it's all about embracing God's divine nature, partaking in God's divine nature across all of us. Check out more at our RCC landing page at soulsandhearts.com/RCC. Consider doing our 19-minute experiential exercise to help you discern whether it's a good idea for you to apply to the RCC. And if you apply, there's still a mutual discernment process that lasts some weeks. It includes the Parts Finder Pro. That's a set of 23 measures to help you come to understand 10 to 15 of your parts, managers, firefighters, and exiles, how they relate to your innermost self, how they relate to each other, and you'll get feedback from your PFP, your Parts Finder Pro, through a 6 to 7 page report. You'll discuss it in a 15-minute Zoom interview with one of our staff members. And all of that's included in our application fee. And we actually have scholarships. If that's difficult for you, you can contact Pam at office@soulsandhearts.com if there's financial need. So go to soulsandhearts.com/RCC to find out more. We have some online workshops for those Catholic formators, priests, therapists, coaches, spiritual directors, anyone who accompanies others individually in their formation. Catholic Parts Work in Human Formation will be on the evening of June 10th, 2026 from 8 o'clock p.m. to 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can check that out. There is a link in the description of this podcast for that. And we also have a retreat for Catholic formators. That will be August 10th to the 13th, 2026 at Mother of the Redeemer Retreat Center in Bloomington, Indiana. The theme is authentic being and authentic relating. And this retreat focuses on you as a formator, you as a therapist, a priest, a spiritual director, a coach. This retreat focuses on you finding and loving yourself in more of your parts, including parts you might not yet have encountered. Right? You can check that out at soulsandhearts.com/FFF. Also check out me hanging out with Chris Stefanik and the Chris Stefanik Show on the episode titled Why Hating Your Worst Self is Making Everything Worse. That just came out. Chris really gets into his own parts, and we just have a fantastic discussion. It's a great introduction to internal family systems as well. Don't forget Dr. Gerry's book, Litanies of the Heart, such good resource there. And there's also a link to that presentation that Mother Natalia mentioned, A Beginner's Guide to Riding Your Hot Mess Express into Heaven, a YouTube video that she offers us. So I just want to thank both of you for being here. This is just amazing. And I have been looking forward to meeting you, Mother Natalia, for quite a while. So it's just delightful. It's such an honor to have you here. This is really beautiful. So thank you for being here. And Dr. Gerry, like, how wonderful that we can get together and spend this time together. It doesn't even feel like work, right? You know, so it could go on for a long time. So
Thank you. It was very good to be with both of you.
Been delightful.
And so we'll bring this to a close by invoking our patroness and our patrons, Our Lady, our Mother, Untied of Knots.
Pray for us.
Saint Joseph.
Pray for us.
Saint John the Baptist.
Pray for
Pray
us.
for us.
And because we have Mother Natalia and Gerry here, Saint Maximus.
Pray for us.
Pray for us.